I have suffered from insomnia for almost my entire life. Going to lay down for the night at 10 and not falling asleep until 4, if at all. Tossing and turning, avoiding the clock, because if you look at the clock, you're going to start doing calculations, figuring out how much time you have left to get to sleep before you have to wake up for the next morning. Inevitably stressing yourself out further and pushing sleep further out of reach. I felt like I tried everything. A nightly dose of melatonin worked at first, but eventually my body became accustomed to it and it lost its effectiveness. I started watching cartoons to help distract my mind, falling asleep to the sounds of Adult Swim. This also worked for a while, until I started reading about the harmful effects of screen time and blue light right before bed. That's when I finally found it. That's when I found Sleep With Me podcast, the podcast that puts you to sleep.
And all I've got to offer is sensitivity, intelligence, and charm.
Sleep With Me podcast is only one of many podcasts that fall under the ever-growing category of sleep podcast. These range from shows like Sleep With Me that feature the oftentimes nonsensical meanderings of host Drew Ackerman under the stage name Scooter. Scoots, if you will. To the more gripping Scare You to Sleep, where host Shelby Scott, tells you a scary story while you fall asleep. For someone like me who's always had trouble transitioning from wake to sleep due to a combination of ADHD and anxiety, these podcasts have been a godsend. But to some, like the author of dystopian novel Fahrenheit 451 and the bad boy of high school lit classes, Ray Bradbury, these podcasts and things like it could be a sign of the end times. Or, at least, Orwell. That's another dystopian guy. Or, more likely, a decline in emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. Or media overconsumption, or whatever. On one of my first nights as a married person, I rolled over and put on my sleep phones and turned on Sleep With Me, the podcast that puts you to sleep, like I had nearly every night for years. That's when my spouse turned to face me and reminded me of this passage from Fahrenheit 451.
And in her ears, the little seashells, the thimble radios tamped tight, and an electronic ocean of sound, or music and talk coming in on the shore of her unsleeping mind. The room was indeed empty. Every night the waves came in and bore her off on their great tides of sound, floating her wide-eyed toward the morning. There had been no night in the last 2 years that Mildred had not swum that sea, had not gladly gone down in it for the 3rd time.
Yikes. So then, am I and everyone else who uses these podcasts to help fall asleep doomed to become these empty shells like Mildred? Just like this dystopian prediction of the future says? Let's take a closer look. About 4 millennia ago, an ancient Babylonian wrote down a lullaby sung by a mother to her child, the first written record of such a thing. We don't know if the lullaby was successful or not at getting the baby to go to sleep, but it's the thought that counts. The point is, we've been singing songs and telling stories to put each other to sleep for a very, very long time. The first electronic version of this came in 1962 with the Marpac Dome Classic Sound Machine. The machine was simple, using an internal fan to generate white noise, and it's still available to this day. Go get yourself a classic dome noise machine. This machine eventually evolved into machines that produced nature sounds, rain effects, something called gray noise, etc. It became commonplace for couples to have TVs in their bedrooms, falling asleep to the evening news, bad B-movies, infomercials, and crime dramas. In more modern times, it definitely seems like sleep podcasts have become the lullaby of choice. According to 2019 data from Edison Research, more than half of the 6,000 people surveyed in the study reported listening to a podcast at bedtime, and that number has only been growing since the events of 2020, leaving people searching for a safe place to fall asleep. For many Puritan types, the scary part of this, causing some sort of vague moral panic, is the removal of the human element. Physically in the room, reading a bedtime story or singing a lullaby. But are these fears based in reality? Well, like with most things, it's complicated. Kind of. I guess spoilers for the rest of the video. Not really. Not really. A 2016 study published in the scientific journal Nature found that listening to stories and podcasts activates multiple parts of your brain, including the areas responsible for sensory processing, emotions, and memory making. This is also, obviously, also true for podcasts that you listen to right before bed. So the concern here is that you're activating your brain juice. Ew, why did I say that? Brain juice. A little bit too much before entering REM and storing all those memories from the day away. Basically, consuming all that information right before going to sleep can make it more complicated for your brain to sort it all away, possibly resulting in a less restful sleep. But here's where that argument kinda falls apart. We actually know very little about sleep, and, well, the brain in general. So these bold claims about what's good or not good for you while you fall asleep are shaky at best. If you're interested in more about how our brains work at night and things like where dreams come from, I recommend The Mind at Night by Andrea Rock. It's a brief little read. It's not hard to get through. It's interesting, too. It's an interesting breakdown of all that stuff, and how the facts about all that stuff are always evolving as we learn more about the slab of meat piloting this thing. Yay! But irregardless, even if listening to a podcast is overstimulating our brains right before that all-important time of rest, it seems that the most popular of these podcasts have found ways to work around our brain's wiring and make us not pay attention, while still offering a distraction. Get Sleepy, a podcast launched in 2019 and hosted by Thomas Jones, follows a strict set of rules to keep things, well, sleepy. A few of the rules are as follows. No dialogue. Dialogue requires more processing power from the listener's brain. Use simple language. Feature a lot of tactile and sensory descriptions. Avoid topics that might upset the listener, no matter how innocuous it might seem. No mention of cramped spaces or bugs, etc. You get the picture. These are just a few examples of the rules, and they all seem to make sense to me. But why does it make sense to me? Why does it work? Well, you guys aren't gonna like this. According to Dr. Matt Jones, a neuroscientist at the University of Bristol, it is impossible to disentangle, really, how they might be working. If a sleep podcast is working for people, it's probably working in different ways for different reasons. Okay. So I guess if we're looking for a hard scientific reason, we're out of luck. Likewise, if we were looking at this from the side of things that believes that these podcasts are somehow harmful, there's little to no hard scientific evidence that proves that's the case either. The strongest argument seems to be that these podcasts actually keep you up later and result in a less restful sleep. But from my own personal experience, I'd have to disagree. A lot of people are benefiting from these, especially people who are neurodivergent and have a hard time getting their brains to shut up. Aside from that, it seems to be some vague moral fear-mongering about the overconsumption of media. Which, yeah, fair, media overconsumption is definitely a thing, but not necessarily a thing that is relevant to the use of sleep podcasts. We aren't all Mildred Montag, constantly bombarding ourselves with distractions until we quite literally overdose from them. We're just people who need a little extra help getting to sleep. I guess I should say I don't hate Ray Bradbury. I'm honestly just picking on this specific passage from his most famous book because it's relevant. And I think it points to a broader trend that rubs me the wrong way. People needing tools to help them do natural human things is not cause for moral panic. I want to pause here to tell a personal story. Yay for anecdotal evidence. I attended a Christian conservative college from 2013 to 2017. One of my close friends at that school received special accommodations for her ADHD. Extra time on tests, stuff like that. I also received the same accommodations, but our experiences were very different. Most of my professors were totally understanding of my accommodations, asking if I needed the extra time, double checking that I understood the material, all good things. My friend had a less than positive experience. During the first week of the new semester, my friend was called into the office of one of the arts professors. This professor taught one of the humanities courses required by the school for graduation. As soon as she entered his office, he handed her a box of tissues and said, "You might need this." Okay. He then proceeded to explain that he received an email explaining the accommodations to be granted to my friend because of her ADHD. Then he started berating her, telling her that he would not be allowing her to make use of these accommodations. That God gives us all hardships, and it's our job to work through them on our own. It would be wrong and unfair to use earthly aids. Of course, she cried, thanks for the tissues, and took the issue to the school administration, who did nothing. Obviously, this is pretty extreme and pretty disgusting, but I do think it's similar to the moral panic surrounding things like sleep podcasts. You wouldn't tell someone who uses a wheelchair that they can't bring their chair to class because God gives us all hardships. Or maybe he would, he's a real piece of work. So why tell someone who's suffering from insomnia that they're actually destroying their brains by using a podcast to help them fall asleep? Obviously, insomnia and a physical disability are not the same things. Disclaimer, I'm not claiming that. What I am saying is stop the moral panic and go to bed. Going to sleep can be hard. Just because it's easy for you doesn't mean it's easy for everyone else. Just like sitting through an exam, reading a book, walking up a flight of stairs, anything really. You aren't cheating or weak or doing some sort of damage to your brain because you need help. There's very little to no evidence to support that, aside from a vague sense of morality or whatever it is they're using to shame people these days. If it helps you and it isn't hurting anybody, then it helps you. Use it. Anyone who tries to convince you otherwise is a big nerd loser. Sorry, Mr. Bradbury. Well, I guess that's all I have to say about that. Hey friends! I definitely chose violence at the end there, huh? I want to give a huge shout out to my friend Felicia over at Girly Gore for doing that Fahrenheit 451 reading earlier. If you're a fan of spooky things, I can't recommend her channel enough. If you liked this video, why not give it some engagement? You know, give it a like, maybe a comment. If you'd like to see more, I have great news. You can even subscribe. Amazing! If you'd like to support the channel, links to my Patreon and merch are in the link tree down below. I'm actually starting saving up for a new camera since the one I've been using is pretty heckin' old. I just said heckin' in 2021. So any support would be appreciated. Cameras, it turns out, are stupid expensive. And you also get some fun perks if you become a patron. Woo! If you didn't like the video, geez, you must be fun at parties. Bye! Or, well, at least a decline. Why can't I talk?